Welcome back to the podcast, Matt. It seems like it's been a while, doesn't it, since we've both been together on a podcast episode, and a slight change of venue as well.
Absolutely, but the award-winning Anton Deck of athletics, as we've been called, are back. You can keep us down, but never out.
Absolutely, yeah. Back in, will we say popular demand? Can we say that?
Hope so, yes.
But yeah, how are you, buddy? How's things? What have you been up to? I know it's been a while since you've been on, so please enlighten our audience who are big fans of yours, like what's been happening in Matt Long's world.
Yeah, a little bit of recreational running, still enjoying my park running. I've got back into a little bit of kind of semi-structured training of late. I'm about to race in a Masters Mile event this evening over in Worcester, and a 5K on the track on Friday night.
Nice, yeah. Well, that's a bit of under distance and over distance for you there. But actually, you went more over distance recently on the track because did I hear you were doing a 10K as well? Is that right?
Yeah. 25 laps of the track. Blooming heck.
Wow.
I was very disappointed you didn't come to put the pound coins in the meter to keep the floodlights going, Lewis.
Hey, well, you're saying this, you're underselling yourself. I hear there was medals wrapped around your neck at the end of the race, so you must have done all right.
Midland Masters silver, yes, and it was part of the British Masters Championships over in Oxford, not at the famous Bannister track where we were a few weeks ago, obviously for the 4-minute mile celebrations, but this was at a place called Horsepath, and it was part of a kind of wider festival of athletics. There was throws, there was jumps, things like that as well.
Brilliant. Well, I know we're going to go on to talk about durability. That's why we're here, Matt. We're going to talk about durability, and particularly the longer distances, and whether that's, whether that plays a factor in 10,000 meters or not. We're going to focus a lot more on kind of the marathon and maybe ultra endurance performance. But you're talking a lot about kind of the Masters scene there, which I know you've got a big hand in. You're a England Masters team manager. And a lot of people ask us a lot of the time, they message in, and some of our athletes ask about how they can get involved in the Masters scenes. You're obviously very familiar with that here in the Midlands, but if people are listening to the podcast, Masters athletes specifically, where can they find out about these Masters races that you take part in and other people competing as well?
Yeah, if you simply type into Google England Masters road running, that will take you to a series of web-based resources which will talk to you about the qualification races that we offer, but also the kind of qualification standards, the minimum qualification times which you have to achieve in order to be considered, as well as doing a kind of a qualification race. And anybody that wants to contact me about that, I'll refer you on to our excellent head of the program, Chris Hollinshead. That's his job, to look after the Masters program. But, email me at mattlongcoach@gmail.com, and I'll gladly provide you with more information.
Brilliant. Given your email out on the podcast, he's going to be inundated now with messages. But Matt's brilliant at getting back to people, and I just thought it was worth sharing that and worth highlighting, because we do get a lot of questions about the Masters stuff, and it's becoming a very busy scene, isn't it? A very popular scene, and it's a great scene that seems to be growing in interest and getting a lot of traction, I guess.
It is, and I think that there's several high-profile athletes of late that have kind of bridged the kind of senior Masters divide. I mean, Gemma Steele, who's known to both of us at Loughborough University, comes along to support some of our track nights as well. Charnwood AC athlete, as you well know. Again, you talk about people there that seem to value an England Masters vest just as much as they still value an England senior vest, and they're of the age, late 30s, early 40s, where they're still able to go for both.
Brilliant, yeah. And I think back in the day, there was maybe a little bit of a stigma attached to the Masters, and I just don't think people were competing for as long. They got to a certain age and they thought, oh, my competition days are now over. But that stigma has definitely been kicked into touch now, because people are competing longer, and there's some great inspiration out there. I mean, I was watching a video yesterday of a 80-year-old smashing a 100-meter record over in America. I think it's fantastic. It provides inspiration to us all to keep going, and that longevity in the sport. And I guess it's a nice link to the topic we're going to talk about today, durability. It is a word that could be associated with longevity, and staying in the sport. But it's a topic that has been hot discussion and hot topic around the endurance world for some time. You have penned an article very kindly, Matt, that is going to go live on the New Levels Coaching website, and that should be out in time with this podcast recording. We're actually recording this podcast on Global Running Day. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, Matt. It's Global Running Day today. That's the date. So it's June the 4th. But this podcast will go live in a few weeks' time, and the article that Matt has penned on durability will come out with that. But I just kind of wanted to start there, Matt. When you heard the term durability in relation to running, what were your first thoughts on that? And what does durability mean to you just as a concept?
Well, again, I think it's interesting that very often as coaches and athletes, coach educators, we can use these terms which are the water can be muddied. We can end up talking past each other. So I had the misconception that durability originally meant going months and months on end without getting injured. I guess that's a type of durability, but really what we're looking for to define durability from a strict kind of sports scientific point of view is the work of somebody like Dr. Andy Jones, who served as a physiologist, as you know, to one of our ambassador, New Levels Coaching Ambassador Paula Radcliffe. And he said it's the ability to resist fatigue and maintain performance during prolonged exercise. So it really is within a race, within a session, rather than over a period of time within a macrocycle or microcycle of training even.
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to start. And Andy Jones has kind of, I guess, coined that phrase really, and has done a lot of research into this area, and other people have now started to research it further. But from talking to Andy at the endurance, it was an endurance weekend actually up in Leeds last year. There was a marathon weekend there. I had the privilege of taking a couple of athletes up there. George, who's one of our performance athletes with the NLC performance team, he was part of that weekend. Gemma was also part of that weekend. And durability was a big factor. And I know Andy and his team have done a lot of research into what is durability and how does it present within endurance sport. And I guess what we're talking about here is it's in kind of a singular factor. And what we mean by that is they're looking at durability in the event itself, rather than, as you said, Matt, you could look at durability over a period of time and say, is somebody durable in terms of, are they able to withstand the training that they're given? Are they less injury prone? Are they able to have that longevity in the sport? But what we're talking about specifically with the term durability in relation to performance is, how does that affect performance, particularly when we start going into the back end of races such as the marathon? And to give people a definition here, I think you defined it really well with what Andy said, but just simply getting this offline in an endurance context. So it refers to an athlete's ability to maintain their physiological performance, things like VO2 max, pace, or threshold, despite fatigue accumulation during prolonged exercise. It is a crucial factor for success in long events, as it determines how well a runner can resist the physiological changes that typically occur over time. And I think that puts it really nicely in a sense of, can we resist those changes? Because what we see in these longer distance events, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but people are almost running the same effort, and we talk a lot about RPE and the effort. They're running at the same sustained effort, and it gradually starts to feel harder and harder and harder. And despite the effort level being exactly the same, the physiological state of the athlete, what's going on under the bonnet, is actually changing dramatically. And that has a big implication on the outcome of their performance.
Definitely. And you've mentioned Dr. Andy Jones and your work with him and our own ambassador, Paula Radcliffe. But you're in a unique position here, unless I'm mistaken, Lewis, because you're not only a high-profile coach and elite coach of elite athletes, but you also took part in a study which our own Richard Blagrove, an exercise physiologist, a senior lecturer, an S&C coach based here at Loughborough University, helped conduct within the last year, 2 years. Can you say about your position as a research subject in that research?
Yeah, it was a brilliant study, and it was one I was keen to get involved in as soon as I heard the term durability. I sometimes think it's great having access to this research, but I think it gives you a deeper level of understanding when you're actually a participant within the research. You get a real feel for what they're trying to achieve, and by going through that study, I could understand what they were trying to achieve, and I could also see the effects on myself. And they did two different types of research. Actually, there was a couple that they did. One was a strength and conditioning intervention to see if strength and conditioning had any effect on an athlete's durability, and particularly looking at running economy in that setting. I guess the downside to the research, and it was really hard for them, although they did a really good job at getting a very good level of athletes into the lab. The level of athlete that they got in was very high, and there was quite a lot of them given the kind of level they were going after.
Yeah,
But the
they're all under
downside.
246, 245, 246 marathon runners or better, weren't they? Unless I'm mistaken.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I think I can't remember, but somebody was talking about kind of the average 10K time, and the average 10K time of the participants was, I can't remember exactly. I'd have to go back and look at it, but I'm sure it sat somewhere between sort of 32 and 33 minutes, which, as an average for a study, like that is a high level. I may be getting that slightly wrong, but I know what we're talking about here. What we would class as front of the pack runners, really.
Yeah.
And that's what they were looking at, to see if they could get the answers and the durability answers from those people, those participants. Now, Loughborough is a hotbed, so it's a bit easier to get people from Loughborough at that standard, but they did a great job at recruiting the right people. The downside to it was the length of time the testing was, because in order to inflict this kind of durability, I guess, yeah, for us to see the changes that they wanted to see, you've got to be on the treadmill for a long time.
Yeah.
So
Was it not?
it
Was it
involved.
2 runs you did or more? I think you did a 90-minute treadmill run and then a 2-hour one. Have I got that right or wrong?
Yeah, if I can remember it exactly, it's been a while since I even looked back at the study. But yeah, we went in the lab and you did some testing and some kind of baseline testing. And that was also followed by a 90-minute run, and then a maximal test at the end to determine some further speeds. And then from that initial testing, we came back. I can't remember exactly. It must have been about 12 weeks down the line, I think. And we came back in the lab. Obviously, everybody comes back in at a different stage. And we then had to complete a 2-hour run. And the speed at which we were going to do that 2-hour run was based on our initial testing. So they collated the results. They took the numbers that they needed to collate, and they said, right, you're now going to do a 2-hour run at kind of this moderate intensity. And they determined that moderate intensity from your initial testing. However, during that time, some people had been in groups where they'd been given kind of S&C interventions to see if that strength and conditioning intervention would help with the second test, and the control group was compared against another group, and the findings were fantastic, really. I don't know if you want to share some of those, Matt, from what was shared and what you wrote the article about.
Yeah, we'll move on to the findings. But before we do that, I just want you to help me, Lewis, because there'll be a number of people that have been on the brilliant physiology workshops that we ran. We had one in Birmingham recently led by our own Dave Sheldon. And there might be listeners thinking of going on or booking on some of our workshops. But I think there were 4 key or classic physiological variables that I want you to help me and the kind of listeners with, really. Shall we go through them one by one and then talk about the findings?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's go
Yeah.
for
So,
it. Yeah.
so in simple terms, what does VO2 max mean? We know it's about the maximum amount of oxygen the body can absorb, but in very simple money, what does that mean? How would you
Yeah,
explain it?
so yeah, it's a really good question. Actually, you've defined it pretty nicely there, Matt. It's like, well, it is exactly that. It's the maximum amount of oxygen that we can get in and utilize in the body. And how I like to look at it, if you use a car analogy, it's
Yeah.
how big your tank is. So how
How
big
big
the
is
petrol tank is. And I think that's just a really nice analogy for people at home to listen and think, right, how big is that tank? How much oxygen can you actually get in that tank? And that is our VO2 max. How much oxygen can we get in and utilize? And usually what we see is there is a correlation, especially with 5K, 10K runners, where generally speaking, the larger that VO2 max, the better they are as performers. Generally speaking, that is a positive correlation that we see. Why is that the case? Well, particularly over 5K, it relies heavily on that system, the VO2 max energy system. So that's why we tend to see a correlation with performance there.
So great. That's variable one nailed, VO2 max. Give me, if we can continue with the motor vehicle analogy, running economy. What's that
Yeah,
about?
so Yeah, really good. Yeah, so we can keep that analogy with the car going. So running economy is how efficiently you use that oxygen. So how I like to see it is, if you've got your car analogy again, it's your miles per gallon, really. How effectively, how efficiently are you using that fuel with your car? And we all know that cars have a different miles per gallon, how efficient they are at using their fuel. Now, oxygen is obviously giving us our energy. We've got to utilize that oxygen for our aerobic benefit. So then how effective can our body utilize that? And that really is running economy. That generally speaking, the lower you can drive that running economy, it's generally lower the better. But the higher the running economy is, that the less efficient you are.
Okay, that's 2 down, 2 to go. So we've dealt with number 1, VO2 max. Number 2, you're giving us a nice simple explanation of running economy. Determined to stump you. Speed at lactic threshold.
Oh
Explain
wow!
that.
So yeah, it's a good one. Are we talking about lactate term point one, or are we talking about lactate threshold, which I would class as lactate term point two? And I think it probably is the second one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Explain the difference then to the listeners, Lewis. What's the difference between the first point and the second point? Because we've done some work on threshold and tempo style running, which falls between the two, haven't we?
Yeah, we have. And yeah, you're really testing my physiology knowledge here, Matt. I'm glad I listened to Dave. But yeah, it's probably worth saying at this point, there's a great physiology podcast that I've done with Dave that people could go back and refer to, where he talks about these training zones and very, very much simplifies them as well. And I think it's a really good starting point for people to go back and listen to that as well. So if you really like your physiology, there's a great podcast that we've done already that covers this. But yeah, I'm happy to go through it again for the context of this episode. So
Hmm.
LT1, lactate turn point one, to clarify to everyone, we've always got lactate moving around in the body. We always have some level of lactate. We don't have zero lactate at any point. Even sat here now, there would be some lactate accumulating within the body. And lactate turn point one is the first point at which we see an elevation in our lactate level. So we'd class anything below that as being what we call like a baseline measure. But lactate turn point one is the it's like our first point that we see that level change. So it goes above baseline. And generally speaking, lactate turn point one sits at an intensity of what we usually call like a moderate to steady intensity. But if you were exercising aerobically and very easy in that kind of recovery or easy domain, then we would tend to see the lactate staying at or close to that baseline. And the reason for that is because we're not reliant on our lactate system at that point. We're exercising purely aerobically. So we're exercising with our oxygen. We're not exercising without our oxygen. We haven't put the anaerobic demand or stress on the system yet. And that's where LT1 sits. Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. The lower threshold point. Yeah, I've got you.
So then where does LT2 sit? Well, we often refer to that as our threshold, and I like to refer to it as the threshold. And I've taken this nicely from Dave. He's the one I've learned from in this area. The reason I like the term threshold being associated with the second term point is because once you go above a threshold, there's no coming back. Unless you slow down or you stop, that threshold is just going to continue to rise. And this is true with our lactate levels. So when you go over lactate turn point two, what we'll see is a spike in blood lactate, which isn't going to come back down unless we slow down or we stop and we rest. So blood lactate is going to continue to rise. Where does that sit? Well, that sits, anything that we were talking about being VO2 max level, that would sit above lactate threshold 2. And then what we're trying to do is develop what we call that threshold system, our ability, our speed at threshold, as you quite rightly touched on, Matt. And what that is between lactate turn point 1 and lactate turn point 2 is we are seeing an elevated level of lactate in the blood. But if we are truly below lactate turn point 2, below that second threshold, what our body is very good at is clearing that lactate. So it's using the lactate as an energy source, but being able to clear it at the same time at which it is generated. So we're generating lactic acid, but we're also able to clear it at a similar rate. So it
Yeah, I think the
doesn't go
physiologists
above the
call it.
threshold.
Sorry to interrupt you there, Lewis. I think the physiologists refer to it as the lactate shuttle, the work of Brooks in 1986, I think.
Yeah, it's a really nice way of putting it. Yeah, and it's able to clear it at the same rate. It's shuttling it out, so we don't see that spike. And we see again, yes, it may be rising a little bit. And generally speaking, for most people, that would see, your lactate level would sit somewhere between LT1 being somewhere around 2 millimoles, and then LT2 sitting somewhere around 4 millimoles, as an example. And
Yeah.
whilst you're in that zone, that middle zone, that threshold zone that a lot of people talk about, that's where people say you are in your threshold. And we see a lot of the training terms come from that. I think that zone's pretty big. I think that's the difference between how I talk about tempo and threshold is I think that zone is too big just to call threshold. So I like
Yeah.
to break it down and say we've got tempo in there, we've got threshold in there.
Yeah, and that's often why we're a little bit ambiguous where we say to our athletes it might be between a 7 and an 8 out of 10 on the aforementioned RPE scale, isn't it?
Yeah, and I guess that's a good place to start there, Matt, is like where would LT2 sit for me on an RPE scale? Well, I define that as 8 out of 10.
Yeah.
9 out of 10 is my VO2 max work. And by the end of a session, that's probably getting closer to 10 because you're operating at maximal capacity, right? So it's gonna feel hard.
Yeah.
10 out of 10 could actually be something like a real lactate session, which some of our middle distance runners do, and that could be up at 10 out of 10. But then tempo for me would sit at 7 out of 10. So tempo is 7. Then I've got threshold at 8, and then I've got my steady down at 6. And that sits just in and around that LT1 that we were talking about earlier, which is a pace you can generally sustain for up to around about 3 hours in time, generally speaking, well-trained athletes.
That's really useful for the athletes that have been coming to our track nights on a Fridays, Lewis, as well. That scale that we always use, running to feel, not split. So thanks for that.
And we use that a lot, don't we? And I think a lot of people say, "Oh, you should be able to hold threshold for an hour." I think the best trained athletes in the world can hold threshold pace for an hour. I don't think that's necessarily true for everybody. And I think with all this physiology, we've got to understand that everybody is different. And I tend to work off a scale of, okay, well, most people are going to be able to hold threshold pace for around about 45 minutes, give or take. But I also think, just as a guide, that's a good, it's a good way to think about it. If you're training and you're thinking, right, I'm going to go and do some threshold reps, and you've got 5-minute reps, it's not a case of, I want to run this rep at 5-minute intensity. It's, could you hold this pace that you're doing for 5 minutes for 45 minutes?
Yes.
And if you can, you're probably operating around about threshold intensity.
Good, brilliant. Well, I've tried to stump you out at VO2 max, running economy, speed at lactic threshold. I think I deserve to give you a break. Shall I give you the fourth one? Shall I do the fourth one? Well, I'm going to cheat.
What are we talking?
It's fractional utilization of VO2 max, which Richard Blakegrove, when I interviewed him, thinks is really, really important. And I'm going to partly cheat here because these are Richard's words, but he talks about it as being, he's almost saying that the VO2 max, think of it as the height of a ceiling, in the living room. And fractional utilization for Richard is the percentage of that ceiling that we use during exercise. So for him, the higher the better. And it is correlated with the kind of speed at lactic threshold. And often he says that those terms are used interchangeably. Does that make any sense to you, my friend?
It does. It's something that I've worked on a lot, particularly with the ultra trail athletes that I work with, because one thing that you might want to see, and I'm going to use your analogy here, or Richard's analogy, and Richard's also been on the podcast as well, by the way, in the past. He's done a really good podcast with us on S&C specifically, but he is a lecturer in physiology here as well, which is why he's such a good person to learn from. But raising that ceiling, so if somebody's fractional utilization is really close to their ceiling, that can be a skill, that can be a real quality if they can sit really high towards their VO2 max for a very long time. There's some people who can do that. They can be right up there, 95, 96% of VO2 max, and they can hold it for a very long time. However, it can also be a limitation. And if they are that type of athlete, what you might have to do is you might have to raise that ceiling. you might have to go away and work on VO2 max and try and raise the ceiling. And that's sometimes what I do with periodization of training, particularly my ultra trail runners early on in the years. I'll say, right, we don't always want to be doing, smashing out the longer work and doing a lot of steady and a lot of threshold work. Let's go and do a block of VO2 max work, and let's try and raise the ceiling. So then if you do raise the ceiling, guess what? And you've increased that ceiling. So now your fractional utilization is not sitting as high as it was before. So you've got a little bit of scope there. You've got a little bit of wiggle room to play with. So I think it's, does that make sense, Matt?
Yeah, so all of those four key variables we've collectively defined, and you did ask me several minutes ago for the results. And before we get into the minutiae of the detail, I think it's worth summarising the results and the key takeaway, which I allude to in the article from the lab-based studies, which you and several others took part in, was that those 3 or 4 key physiological variables, they're never static. They change, they move. And it always makes me laugh the way that athletes tend to panic where they look at their watch and their VO2 max has shifted or whatever. They're never really comfortable with that. And I think there's a lesson to be learned that we have to acknowledge that, these variables do change quite quickly as well as over time. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, they do. And I think the other thing to say here is your watch is very inaccurate when it comes to those measures. The only way we'll get an accurate measure of VO2 max is actually by being in a lab and having a mask on that is going to take the oxygen and it's going to be able to measure that oxygen intake. If it's not that, it's going to be nowhere near. Like the VO2 max reading on your watch is going to be made up of a number of different factors that it's pulling from, and there's an algorithm that's going to give you a VO2 max reading, but it is not an accurate measure. And I want to make people aware of that, because I think sometimes it can be a real confidence hit for some people when they see it drop. But what the watch is doing, it's just taking the data that you're feeding it. If you've not had your heart rate monitor on for a couple of weeks, it might assume that your VO2 max has dropped, for example. So don't always take everything from your watch, but absolutely, Matt, we see the watch change its readings, but that is what happens in real life as well. Like, it's probably not as big a shift as people think, but things are shifting all the time. And also, whilst we're training, it's also worth noting, we're not always just training one system either, are we? And I think that's a big thing that physiologists try and get across. We're not just working a VO2 max system. The energy systems are always interlinked, and we're always working them all in some way.
Yeah. And so the key findings there are that VO2 max reduced, speed at lactic threshold reduced during prolonged exercise, and also, no surprise here, running economy tends to be compromised. So those results don't really surprise me. Did they surprise you in any way, or anything we've missed there, Lewis?
And just to clarify that, Matt, is that in relation to the duration? So those
Yes.
things go down over time, is what we're saying here, isn't it?
Over time, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, not a surprise at all to me. I would expect that. I would expect things to change, and I guess that's where people are looking at this as like a durability factor. I guess the question is, how much does it change, and how does that affect the individual athlete, and this is where durability is a very new concept, and they're still trying to figure this out. How much does that then affect performance, and which part of it affects performance? Because it's going to be different for every single different person. So yeah, it wasn't a surprise to me. I think the biggest takeaway from me, and we've discussed this at length in some of our team meetings, is what do we do about it? How do we train it? How do we get to that?
So we've dealt with the what's, to use the experiential learning cycle. We've talked about the so what's in terms of the variables changing that you've kindly defined, but now it's to do with really what I refer to in the article as the training implications, isn't it?
Absolutely. And how do those training implications then affect performance in a positive way? And this is where a lot of people probably don't necessarily, well, I don't understand coaching as much as it is trial and error sometimes, that we don't always have the answers. And this is an area that a lot of coaches are playing around with at the minute to try and figure out. And it'll take us a long time to know exactly how to train durability, but there's some really good concepts coming already, but it's definitely at the moment in that kind of trial, I would say that trial phase.
Yeah, can I just point you specifically to the paper that was published with Richard Blagrove's name on it? Appears, I think, in the Scandinavian Journal of Medical Science and for sports, and it's only just been published last month, and that pointed to two such interventions, which were namely the long run, and then secondly S&C work. Shall we deal with both of them in their turn, Lewis?
Yeah, we definitely should, Matt. And before we go on to it, I just want to give a bit of a shout out to Michele Zanini, who has done a couple of podcasts on this specific paper and the research that he's done. He works with Andy Jones, he works with Rich Blagrove, and it was Michele who got me involved with the study, actually. But I just want to tell a little bit of a story before we go on to it, because I'll never forget, and it takes me back to when the study was happening. But you might remember, Matt, England played in the final, the home final in a Euros for the first time, I think, in our history. We made the final of, what was the year now? Was it Euro 20?
I think it was 2021, wasn't it? Was it pushed back?
2021, because it was delayed. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a pandemic, yeah.
That's right. It was meant to be 2020, but it was 2021. And we played Italy in the final. And Michele is obviously Italian. And my treadmill test was due to be the day after the final, England versus Italy.
No, we lost on penalty. Yeah.
We lost on penalties, that's right. Now, part of the study was that you had to control what you ate the night before. So everybody came around our house for the Euros party to watch England versus Italy. And I had to have one of Michele's homemade pizzas before the test the next day. So an Italian pizza. And I then had to get up in the morning, early morning, go into the lab with an Italian who had his Italian shirt on and had very much bragging rights over me from the football the night before. But yeah, that was when I took part in the study. And I think it's sometimes nice just to reminisce. But moral of the story is I just wanted to give a shout out to Michele, who was a very prominent figure within that study. And yeah, he's done a lot of good podcasts on this as well. So give him a follow on Twitter or X.
I bet you let him pay for the pizza, knowing you, buddy.
I think they were homemade, actually. I can't remember, but yeah.
Free use of a treadmill and free pizza. It's all coming out now. He probably gave you some kit, did he not?
He did not. You stole all that from me.
Okay. Yeah. Can I read out what Richard said to me? Richard Blagrove said to me, he just said when I interviewed him that long runs, particularly at target marathon speed, will naturally develop durability and delay the kind of physiological deteriorations that we've articulated because of specificity. And it just rang the bell of, Canova for me, Renato Canova, in terms of the specificity of the long runs we do in the funneling process. I wondered whether that resonates with you, Lewis, or you took a different angle to what that result would tell us.
Yeah, I guess how I look at it is, how are we going to get our body to a state that is similar to the marathon day without actually doing the marathon? That's the biggest thing for me. How can we actually put ourselves there? Now, great term Josh Schofield used at our coaching conference on Friday. Josh has a company called PGC1 Coaching. We all got together as coaches, which I thought was fantastic. We all learned together. We want to raise the bar of online coaching. I think it's great that we all share our learnings. I really liked the term that he used is we never go into any run fresh. So that's one advantage in a training cycle is we're going into our long runs often in a bit of a fatigued state, whereas we go into the marathon fresh. So automatically in training, there's going to be a level of fatigue there. So that's good. But we need some level of specificity or overload in order to create that physiological response, or I guess a physiological breakdown, so that we're going to train durability. Because if we don't go hard enough, then we're not going to get the stimulus, not going to train the durability that we're after. So if we just go and run easy, then we're probably not going to get there. And if you do just run easy, you're probably going to have to run for a very, very long time for that to happen. And you probably don't have time to do that. So and it probably then has a knock-on effect on everything else in your training cycle. So there's got to be some level of specificity in there with either marathon pace, but I'm going to throw a slight spanner in the works. You mentioned our coach, Ambassador Paula Radcliffe. Now, she used to run a lot to marathon effort rather than marathon pace, as we know.
Feel not split,
Feel not split. And that's because she used to do a lot of her training up at altitude, but she also used to do a lot of her marathon training on the trails and on the hills. So by in turn running a marathon feel, marathon effort, and not a marathon split, but adding in some form of overload element, which in this case was the hills, she's automatically demanding more of her body at that feel intensity, which I think did a really good job at creating durability for her, because the overload in her factor wasn't the fact that she was running just at marathon pace in training for a big length of time. It was that the undulation within the run, the terrain was putting an increased demand on her musculoskeletal system. It was putting
Yes.
more damage through the legs. And aerobically, it's more challenging as well to be going up and down hills. So I think she was very clever without knowing it at becoming a very durable athlete by
Mm.
changing the demands of that long run. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah, almost intuitive, yeah.
So yeah, so I think there's definitely something there, but we had a discussion, Matt, you and I work with athletes and we help each other out. And you asked me one time, what do you see the value in these harder long runs? I think you quite rightly said, I've come from more of a Lydiard approach. There was a lot of longer, slower runs with a lot of the marathon runners back in the day. And
Yeah.
there seems to be a bit of a shift now. And I said, yeah, I'm definitely more on the side of, we need some hard long runs in there, marathon specific long runs. But I also think we've got to be careful with how we put them in. We've got to make sure there's a big cost to these long runs. And you've got to make sure that you recover well off them. And they've got to be done with anything. They've got to have a progressive overload element to them. You can't just
Mm.
go throw them in. You've got to progress over time. And I know that you're very big on that with how you then progress people over a plan and periodize that plan.
Definitely. And I think you're right. You're perceptive to allude to that cultural shift, Lewis. I remember back in the day, in the 80s and even early 90s, athletes, would often just say that the Sunday long run is all about time on your feet. And I think that there has been a change in terms of conventional wisdom and common sense about that.
Yeah, I agree. I think when I first came to the coaching world, I think that was generally my theory, go out and get time on feet. And don't get me wrong, I still use it particularly in the ultra endurance space.
Mm.
You've got, because I think where there's a big advantage there is for our ultra runners who are listening in, you get time on your feet out there, but you get time to practice things like your nutrition over like 4, 5, 6 hours. And, I'm not scared to give my ultra runners 6-hour long runs if they're going to be out for 24 hours, for example. Because I think that's the only real test of how can you handle the nutrition for that length of time, and how can you handle the hydration and those elements. So time on feet is still relevant, but I think it is becoming less relevant, particularly and I think this is where we've got to be careful with how we phrase this, particularly for the performance side of the marathon, because if we look at it from a physiological perspective, the people who are running a marathon in 2 hours 30, for example, the
Mm.
intensity of that marathon is very different to somebody who's taking 5 hours for the marathon.
Yes.
Back to your initial point of our training zones, 2 hours 30 sits at that moderate to almost steady intensity. And when you're running for 5 hours, it sits more in the easy to moderate intensity. So the durability becomes a different type of durability. The durability for a 5-hour marathon runner does come down to time on feet. But this study in particular was assessing more at the performance level. And I think that's what I want to get across to our audience in particular, that marathon pace for a lot of people who are running 4 to 5 hours is probably in and around usual easy run pace anywhere.
Yes.
So they're training that durability factor a lot more than they maybe think, whereas a 2 hour 30 marathon runner, for example, touches that pace a lot less in training.
Good. Great analogy. So we've dealt with the traditional long run. The second intervention, which was mentioned in that paper that you're involved with, was S&C work and the importance of that. And this reminded
Yeah.
me of the excellent podcast that you did with the aforementioned Richard Blager. I think it was episode 22, where you looked specifically at different ways of S&C training. And Richard was saying that it is all about offsetting or delaying those kind of fatigue processes in the neuromuscular system, that S&C specifically can do. Do you want to talk a little bit about your reflections, maybe drawing on that podcast that you did?
Yeah, I think strength and conditioning is really important. I traveled up to Leeds yesterday with Gemma. we're getting help with her strength and conditioning program at the moment because she's ventured into a new type of sport like ultra trail running, where the demand is a lot higher on the body, and we see different demands: downhill running, uphill running, and um, I class myself as fairly knowledgeable with my strength and conditioning, but there's certain things where I need a little bit of extra help, and I don't think you should ever be afraid to ask for extra help either. Um, so I think strength and conditioning is super important when you understand the demands of the event that you're undertaking. Now, what we understand from the marathon is that running economy, which we've already described early on in this podcast, running economy is a big factor when it comes to marathon performance. It's one of the biggest indicators of marathon performance. And what we mean by that is the better your running economy, the more likely it is that you will be better at the marathon. And Andy Jones, who you mentioned earlier, Dr. Andy Jones, did a really good kind of, I think it was either a literature review on running economy, and he quoted Paula's data, how her running economy improved over time when she went to the marathon. What we know about running economy is it can be improved with running more. So that's one way in which running economy improves. But we also know from the work that Rich has done and some of the literature that he's produced in strength and conditioning is running economy can improve from strength and conditioning interventions. And this is why it's so important to understand the demands of the event, because if you know running economy is an important factor and you're wanting to improve that, it doesn't just have to come from the running. It can come from a gym-based setting, particularly with work such as plyometric work being in there. And the reason for that is all to do with how we hit the ground more effectively, and then what effect that has on our running stride and how effect that has on our running economy.
Force production.
Force production, absolutely. Yeah, it's a good way of putting it, Matt. And I think you've got quite a nice example, if I remember rightly, about somebody who you worked with who had felt like their stride length had maybe increased, their force production had become better, and as a result, their performance had become better. And I think the only training intervention that they'd put into their plan was they'd added some running drills or something into a warm-up. Is that right? I remember you telling that on the running technique day.
Yeah, that's right. It was somebody that improved from being basically a 4.5 hour marathon runner to dip below 4 hours. And when we looked at the data and what they were doing training wise, nothing had changed other than that kind of a little bit of kind of stretching and the drills that we would do as part of what we would call a ramp warm up, where we activate and mobilize.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good example of people worry about how to get certain things in their plan. How do I get strength and conditioning into their plan? But running drills, a lot of running drills are plyometric activities, and that is going to create a certain level of stiffness, and stiffness is a good thing in the joints in particular, particularly around the ankle joint, because it gives better use of our tendon then, so we can make better use of the elastic tendon energy that we get. So if we are hitting the ground better, if we're getting a better stiffness off the ground, now our ground contact is better and our force production is better, it's more likely that we will improve our running stride, and our running stride may even lengthen. And as a result, that can in turn have an impact on our performance. But it might be that also we've seen an improvement in running economy as well. And what was one of my big takeaways, although I wasn't in the strength and conditioning group, I believe the strength and conditioning group did improve more than the group who didn't have the strength and conditioning intervention.
Yeah, and that's an interesting second cultural shift. We've spoken about how the quality of a long run, or perception of the need to do tempo blocking within long runs has changed from the 80s. I think the S&C side has changed. I'm not saying people didn't do it back in my day in the 80s, the early 90s, but it was always an add-on. Whereas it's amazing some of the athletes that we both work with, I was talking to one this morning that basically wanted to know that I was going to set a plan starting with some of the excellent videos that yourself and Gemma have done in the plan. Rather than the runs, they wanted me to start with building their S&C in.
Nice. Well,
that wouldn't have happened 30 years ago, wouldn't have happened.
No, and would it be fair to say, Matt, as well, this is definitely my perception, and I'd be interested to get your point of view on this, is that there was also a perception that, well, strength and conditioning is more for those middle distance type athletes because they need speed and power, 1500 meter, 800 meter runners. They rely more on that speed and power, that kick finish. So S&C is more important to those middle distance athletes. I think that was a perception, but
Mm.
over time, I think that's changing, and people are saying, well, actually, the research has shown that running economy could have a big impact. Strength and conditioning could have a big impact on running economy, and that's more relevant to the marathon. So marathon runners should be doing this as well.
Yeah, and people like Paulie, you can lift heavy without bulking up. If you look at her, her physical stature and things like that, she's not a massive person, but she's lifted heavy.
Yeah, she continues to lift heavy as well, and I think she celebrated her 50th birthday this year, and she's still running marathons. And I think it's worth pointing out to our audience that, again, one thing we talk a lot about, strength and conditioning, it's not just performance now. I think the literature is out there to support that it is really important for later in life. We kicked off this podcast about talking about masters athletes and
Mm.
longevity, and that perception of durability in relation to being durable over a long period of time in the sport. And if you want to remain injury free, if you want longevity in the sport, but more than that, if you want to make sure that you're conditioned later in life, I think strength and conditioning is so important. And I know more people are getting into the gym later in life, and I think that is really, really good.
Yeah, and I think one of the great things about somebody like Richard and the physiologists more generally is they always do bow to the coaches to a certain extent, around what we would call as a coach educator being athlete centered. There's an acknowledgement that Richard, I think in one of the papers that he'd written, I wrote it up as a spoonful of sugar. It's on the website, where there was the great debate as to should we stack the S&C work on a hard day where we're sessioning? Should we put it on an easy day? Or the third option, should we microdose it? And there really isn't. And Richard would say this as well. And we know this as coaches. There's no right or wrong answer. We have to be athlete centered, don't we?
Yeah, there's a lot of factors that come into that: people's lifestyle, people's work, people's family commitments, your ability to recover. What time have you got to recover? How do you fit everything in? What training cycle you're in? There's loads of different things that could go into that, but ultimately there's no right or wrong. It's figuring out an approach that is right for you, and the coach and the athlete working collectively in a partnership to figure that out as well. It shouldn't just be one way. And I would say that's a red flag, actually. I'm not pointing out any individual coaches here. That's not what I do. But I'm saying, if you're working with a coach who's telling you you should be doing it this way, this is the only way you can do it, I would say
Mm.
that's a bit of a red flag when it comes to coaching. So just be aware that there isn't just one way to do anything.
I think so. And that's what we touched on at the conference, wasn't it? My own intervention about push coaching versus pull coaching, and coaches are expected to do a little bit of both, but pull is perhaps more in vogue now, where we pull from the athlete. We allow the athlete to work out what's best for themselves as well.
Yeah, definitely. And even as coaches, we pull from each other now, don't we? And I think that's a sign of a good coach, those who are willing to pull on each other and get that information. And athletes shouldn't be afraid to pull from the coach and push to the coach as well. I've got some ideas, what do you think about this, coach? And yeah,
Yes.
I like to think it's a two-way relationship. I think that's when the best relationships come. Like, I've been in a week this week where I've had people race this week. They've had good performances, but they were
That's some
tough
great
races.
performances. Well done on those performances. You've had some great results over the trails, haven't you?
Yeah, appreciate that, Matt. Yeah, there was shout out to Bertie, who had a cracking run at the weekend. Became British champion, and hopefully that's him selected now for Worlds. Unfortunately, Joe, who I coach, went over on his ankle, but both good examples of this week. They've had no plan for the first part of this week. We've been in communication each day. How does the body feel? And they're saying, I feel like I could do this. I feel like I could do that. Okay, well, let's go with that then, because really good physios have said to me, usually the athlete's right. What they feel is actually what's going on, and I don't know how they feel. So got to work together on that. And I think that's a really good example, Matt, of you saying about using that push and pull coaching technique.
That's good. And I don't want to be conceited and push my own article here, but there is one reason why people should read this article, which Gemma's going to put online, on staying power. I've invented a new term. At the end of the article, I say my term is the durability deficit. I'm going to put a PLC or whatever on that,
Trademark.
trademark, whatever they call it, on that. Yes, Matt Long. I hope I've not plagiarised it off anyone, but I think I could be onto a winner here. What do you
So
think?
what? Yeah, explain what you mean by it, Matt.
Well, it's just an assessment as to where you might your durability may have a deficit. At what point in the race do you feel fatigued? Why is that? What are the reasons behind it? How can you address the deficit? You know, your long run may be spot on, but your S&C may be out, or vice versa.
Yeah, and from your perception of that, I think that's. I want to ask you a question now around that. Is so if somebody's listening to that and thinking, oh well, how do I figure out where that deficit is? What are some of the signs that we're seeing as coaches that would maybe suggest they're not as durable as they might think? What happens to them in those longer distances? Let's take the marathon for example. What sort of things happen, and at what sort of distance do we generally see that happen?
Well, again, it's the inability to run a kind of an even pace split, the inability to do what you tend to advocate. You know, your wonderful analogy about banking time and paying back with interest. It's that kind of problem that we see where people can't maintain a particular pace over time, where they may stop and hit the wall or feel as if they're fatigued because their fueling is wrong and they've not got enough energy in their system. Those are the warning signs: dropping off, dropping out, falling away in races, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree. And the extreme versions of people cramping and different things like that, despite it not being very hot, because cramping sometimes isn't just related to the heat. In fact, most of the time it's related to muscular fatigue. And, yes, that can be going out too hard, as we know. But if you
Mm.
don't feel like you're going out too hard, it might be that you're just not durable enough for those longer distances. And one thing probably worth noting, Matt, is it doesn't come overnight either. The best athletes in the world, they recognize that if you're not the most durable, it might take time to get durable. You can't just start going smashing out long runs and then all of a sudden, you Mrs. or Mr. Durable. Just like, I'm picturing Mr. Motivator or Mrs. Motivator. Like those superheroes, they don't exist. We don't get quick fixes. It takes time, and don't be afraid to fail and learn. And I think Paula said that at her marathon workshop that we did in January. Like, the only way that you learn is by sometimes failing in training as well. And it's better to fail in training and then learn from that. And that hopefully will then set you better for your races.
That's great. Fantastic. Lewis, it's been a pleasure talking to you about these issues. We've had some fun along the way.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it, and I hope people can get a lot from the article that you've kindly written as well. And we'll refer to the research as well in our show notes. I think that'd be a good thing to do. So to signpost people to where they can find that research, the same way you found it. So if they want to read further on this topic, they can do. In fact, the references are probably in your article, aren't they, Matt? You're going to put the references at the bottom there.
References are in there, and it's always better to go once you've read the kind of bridging article, as a coach or an athlete, to go to the sports science literature as well and read something in the original.
Brilliant. Yeah. Well, to finish off, Matt, I always like to finish off now with like what we've got coming up in the next month or so. So we'll chat about NLC wise what we've got coming up. We'll also ask you what you've got coming up. You've said you've got a few races on the agenda, but track night, that was last Friday. We've got another one coming up in June, haven't we? Are you enjoying those?
Enjoying them. We did a Dave Moorcroft session last week, didn't we? We did what we called a Bislett Belter session, which was trying to get people to run both to feel and to split and lock in to their 5K paces. We work both to time over a K. We worked both to distance over a K, and we also worked over to time. We worked people on their own. We also did some paired running, some Parloff running, a Germanic word. So there was a little bit of spice in that session, but most people were coming away saying that's really helped me think about how I could try and run a park run PB or something like that.
Nice. Yeah. And you can get involved with our track nights. You can sign up on the website free of charge, come down, benefit from quality coaching from the likes of Matt and Sam. And I think Sonia was there, wasn't she, at the last one as well? And a lot of our coaches, we do vary it, but Matt and Sam are there as regulars. So come down. Loughborough University, they are hosted at the moment. We may put some on elsewhere around the country. Who knows? That's our long-term vision for these track nights. But we want to provide high quality coaching on a track or in a track environment. And we want to do that free as charge for as long as we possibly can. So if you feel like you'll benefit from those track nights, why not come along and benefit from some of those sessions? We just had the physiology workshop, which I know you were part of, Matt. And I think that was another good day, people getting their physiology tested.
Yeah. The chance to run in another elite environment and the track Birmingham University. That was great for people to see. There were some elite athletes training as well on the other side of the track. Different environment to Loughborough, but great as well.
Nice. And if you want to benefit from that sort of physiology, the next one is in August, and we've got the performance weekend. That's on our Runner Retreats website. So if you head over to Runner Retreats, you'll find the performance weekend, which is delivered by the New Levels coaching team. Matt and I will be there for that weekend. In fact, Matt will be there. I might not be there now because I might be somewhere else, but Matt will be there with the team. Physiology day, running technique day as well. Lots and lots to look forward to. So mile for you tonight, did you say, Matt? Is it a mile? Did I get that right?
Doing a mile, four and a bit laps of the track. So I might have a little bit of speed deficit compared to your 4 minute mile best. I reckon I'll be about 6.5 minute mile in tonight.
As long as you don't have durability deficit in a mile, that will be worrying.
Definitely. And have you got any races coming up yourself? Because you're still no slouch. Regularly running 14, 15 minutes for 5Ks.
I'm potentially and hopefully going to be doing a club challenge next Tuesday with Barrow runners. So this podcast will have come out by then. So the race will have happened by the time this podcast comes out, but did the club challenge last year, just a great get together. The clubs have like an inter-club challenge and they do it every year, and somebody hosts it every year. And it's the score is done on, you have to have a set amount of runners. I think it's like your top 30 runners or something like that, and it's a cumulative score. I went there last year and I'm back to defend my title this year, but most importantly, it's not just about that. It's getting together with a really good bunch of people. There's some food afterwards, hog roast and a good drink, and yeah, I just really like that social element. That's what I do it for now. I'm not in it for performance anymore. It's very much a social side for me, and I think that's similar to yourself. I like being part of that community, so I'm going to go and do that next Tuesday.
Definitely. That's great to hear.
Brilliant. Right, well, thanks, Matt. It's been a pleasure having you back on, mate. I know you're going to be busy on the podcast over the next few months, because I think our next episode coming up after this one's released, I think you've got one lined up with Sonia, which I'm really looking forward to as well.
An unusual one. It's psychology as well. It's all about
brilliant
circles of concern and control. So again, whilst, Sonia, Olympic 2016 Olympic marathon runner for Team GB, 2:28:04 best, great coach as well. Whilst marathon runners are going to be drawn towards her, understandably, it really is a podcast for everybody, because the psychological mechanisms that she speaks about, and again, there'll be an associated article to do with her Olympic marathon day and race, can be applied to any race. And she tells me that she uses it with her own New Levels athletes as well.
Brilliant. I'm looking forward to that one. Yep, and that'll come out after this one, of course. So you will see Matt back on the podcast. In the meantime, best of luck to you racing, Matt. Best of luck to our audience who will be racing, I'm sure. And if you're not racing, enjoy your training, and we will see you all again very, very soon.